Good afternoon, everyone. Just letting more people in. So in 2 or 3 minutes, we probably get started. But welcome, everyone. See a lot of people already dropping in, so that's great. Let's give the others 1 or 2 minutes to get started. You see people entering the room, so let's give them 1 or 2 minutes. But welcome, everyone. Good to see that everyone is so good on time. Much appreciated. I see a lot of people entering the room, so that's just great. We expect a whole lot of people, so that's good. All right, so let's just get started, and people will drop in along the way. But welcome everyone to this Exploring European Foundation webinar with a very special guest. I will introduce her in a bit, but this webinar is part of our Fundus Focus series that we organize as HVFC since the beginning of this year to bring a little bit of perspective into the sector. A lot of organizations are struggling and seeking for alternative for donors that are phasing out or they're reducing their funding. So we thought, let's bring in a little bit of inspiration on what is possible and what others are doing perhaps into the sector, hence this webinar. Before we start, let me just quickly explain the house rules again for those of you who are new. This session will be recorded, so you can also watch it afterwards. If you don't want your face to be seen shown on the recording, just turn off your camera. Everything will be shared afterwards as well. So tomorrow morning you will get in your inbox an email with the recording of the presentation or the interview that we have with Delphine. At the end of this webinar, this 45-minute presentation, there is room for question and answer. So you can ask your questions in the chat with a moderator today, Rick, and he will collect the questions and will make sure that they're being addressed. Hopefully all of the questions we can address today. Otherwise, we will come back to you at a later stage. That part of the webinar will not be recorded. So it's the plenary part that will be recorded. And my contact details I will also share in case there's anything you would like to discuss afterwards. You can reach out. But that's not why you're here. You're here to learn about European foundations, and for that we have a very special guest, Delphine. Delphine is the CEO of Philea, and I thought, well, I can introduce Delphine, I can introduce Philea, but she's much better positioned to do so than I am. So Delphine, welcome to this webinar. Maybe you can quickly introduce yourself and the organization you represent.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Han, for the invitation, and thank you to everyone for being here today for this conversation. I'm looking forward to the Q&A and hoping to be able to answer some of your questions, though I have no guarantee about that. So let me say that up front. So my name is Delphine Moralis. I'm the CEO indeed of Philea, the Philanthropy Europe Association. I've joined the philanthropy sector towards the end of 2020, which was in the middle of the pandemic. After having spent the first 20 years of my life or my career primarily working in NGOs and INGOs, mostly in the child rights sector at European and then at global level. And Philea, to just introduce the organization a little bit, it's a relatively young organization. In fact, we're 2.5 years old, but we're the result of a merger between two organizations that had a long history behind them. On the one hand, the European Foundation Center, which was set up in 1989, and Daphne. And the European Foundation Center traditionally brought together larger foundations from across Europe and beyond, and Daphne brought together national associations of foundations. And so Philea itself as an organization was created against the backdrop of a world in crisis. And there was a decision at that moment to bring the two constituencies together to create a stronger backbone for the sector that would be able to respond better to the challenges of our time, really supporting the sector in increasing its ability to support those who we serve, NGOs, INGOs, civil society organizations, artists, researchers, youth communities that need support from philanthropic organizations and much more. And we, in that context, also redefined the functions of the organizations, really to respond what the sector needed. And so today, our focus is very much around learning and connecting, both specifically with regard to philanthropic practices, but also on thematic areas of interest for philanthropic organizations. We also build knowledge, so both kind of horizontally, but also with deep dives around where the philanthropic sector invests its resources, both financially and non-financially. And we also have a role to play in advocating for an enabling space for the sector. And with the creation of Philea, we wanted to make sure that we had a clear definition of the vision that we hold collectively as an organization. That vision today is that we believe in a world where philanthropy can co-shape and support pluralistic, just and resilient societies that center people and planet. So I think that is, to me, definitely an important point in the sense that it does look at philanthropy as, one could say, a means to an end, the end being pluralistic, just and resilient societies that center people and planet. So that's a bit of the vision of the organization, and maybe to tell you a bit more about the constituency that we bring together today. We represent 295 organizations, of which about 230 are foundations and philanthropic organizations. Then another part of our membership is a group of 26 philanthropy infrastructure organizations. And these are mostly national associations of foundations and philanthropic organizations. And then we have a group of associate members, and these include UN agencies, they include think tank research centers that are part of the broader philanthropic ecosystem, but are not either foundations or philanthropic organizations themselves, or associations or infrastructure bodies for philanthropy. And just to add a little bit about the philanthropy infrastructure organizations that we represent, in themselves, they bring together about 7,500 foundations and philanthropic organizations from across Europe. The wider Europe, our definition of Europe is Council of Europe wide. So that again brings kind of that diversity within the membership. And then to already give you a bit about the membership itself in terms of the foundations and philanthropic organizations, because I imagine that that's what's most interesting for you. I wanted to share a bit around how diverse that membership actually is. So we have about 230 foundations within our own membership, and these include 12% of them as family foundations. So these are foundations that have been set up by wealthy families that decide to donate their wealth and their capital to causes they care about. 16% of them are corporate foundations. 17% of them are foundations with banking origins. In some cases, it would be origins from saving banks, but it can be really different depending on the context that we're talking about. We have some community foundations amongst our members. We have enterprise foundations and many other nuances of types of foundations and philanthropic organizations. And then to add a bit more to that, you would see that 55% of our foundations are endowed. So that means that they have assets that they distribute and that they use also in most cases for their grant-making purposes. And that within our membership, from those 230 foundations, about 65% of them are grant-making, and the rest can be either operating foundations, so they have their own programs and they don't give out grants per se, or they both give grants and operate their own programs. So it's a very diverse landscape, which we describe as a forest, because we see that within our membership there are old evergreen foundations that have been there for centuries, but we also have very new kinds of philanthropy coming up And we try to make sure to nurture a soil within which these foundations can do what they do best, learn from each other, and feel that they have opportunities to be inspired and create eventually more impact for the many organizations and communities that they serve. So that's in a nutshell who we are as Philea.
Thank you. Yeah, super diverse, as you mentioned, and impressive how many organizations are directly or indirectly associated with Philea. So that's, I think, for today also, that perspective, I think, is very useful. And probably there are different perspectives within the group, but we'll come back to that in a bit. But so you mentioned that thousands of organizations are directly or indirectly associated with Philea. If you look at the total foundation segment in Europe, the total market, can you tell us a little bit about what are we talking about? How many foundations? What kinds of amounts? And can you tell us a little bit about the landscape? Yeah.
Absolutely. I think the fact that I wanted to mention the diversity that we have within our own membership is because this is really a reflection of what we're seeing for the sector as a whole. So probably unknown to many, and it was definitely not known to me when I joined the philanthropy sector, the European continent has the largest amount of foundations of any continent in the world. According to the data that we collected from 2023, there are over 176,000 foundations across Europe, or public benefit foundations across Europe. So we're not looking at private foundations that have solely as a purpose to continue interests that are related to the family. So public benefit foundations, about 176,000 across the continent, which doesn't mean that we're the most generous continent in the world. I think there are forms of generosity that are really very long-standing and very rich in the African continent, in the Asian continent. We all know about the US philanthropic sector, but Europe as a whole has about 176,000 foundations. And to give you a bit of a flavor of that, if we look at those 176,000 foundations, it really depends from one country to the next. So of those 176,000 foundations, about 25,000 foundations are German foundations. About 21,000 foundations are Polish foundations. And then the other three countries in the top 5 of the most foundations in Europe would be Sweden, Switzerland, and the UK. And then if you unpack that even a little bit more, you would see that Germany has 25,000 and something foundations, but only 7% of those foundations are registered in East Germany. So very much concentrated in West Germany. If you look at the Italian philanthropic sector, which is in the top 10, it's not in the top 5, but it's in the top 10, you would see that only 5% is dispersed in the south of Italy, because a lot of the Italian foundations have, by law or by their statutes, a responsibility of funding locally. And then if you look at Central and Eastern European countries, where the philanthropic sector is less large in terms of the number of foundations, you would see from research that citizens are actually willing to donate much more than they already donate. So you have really kind of a sense of generosity and philanthropic capital, I would say, in terms of a desire to give in Central and Eastern Europe. There's a growth in mid-sized donors in Central and Eastern Europe that is interesting to keep an eye on. And there are also kind of new interesting developments in terms of impact investing in Central and Eastern Europe that, make it an interesting region also to keep an eye on, even if, of course, the context today makes it very difficult also for those countries to develop the landscape. And then you have countries like Denmark, for instance, where the country is not in the top 5 in terms of the most foundations that they count, but they have some of the biggest foundations in Europe. So thinking of Novo Nordisk Foundation, for instance, which is an enterprise foundation. So that means that they have a philanthropic purpose, but they also own a company, Novo Nordisk pharmaceutical company. And those kind of foundations are very large in size, obviously, compared to some of the smaller foundations that perhaps you have in other countries. And then in terms of kind of giving of the sector, according to our data, which we've captured, I think it was 26 countries that we were able to get into this data effort. The total amount of annual giving, according to that latest overview, was 77 billion euro that was donated in grants, which of course is a relevant amount of money, but it's much smaller than public funding. And I think what is valuable about philanthropic giving is not purely the amount of giving, but is also the kind of giving and the quality of giving, with philanthropic organizations being well placed to, for instance, take risks, fund on the long term, fund in a more innovative way, and kind of do that different kind of relational work than what public funding can do. So that's in a nutshell a bit about the size of the sector. And maybe I don't know how much detail you'd like on this, but kind of to shine a light on how the sector is so different from one country to the next. So you remember that I said that Poland is the second largest amount of foundations, which may be surprising, but it doesn't mean that you have a very high amount of giving in Poland, or that the amount donated by foundations is really large. And when we look at kind of one country to the next, the operating space for philanthropy really determines the market and determines the sector. And things like the ease of operation, tax incentives, the socioeconomic environment, the political environment, all of that really influences whether you have a foundation sector that is very active, or whether you have a foundation that's a little bit less active. And kind of in general terms, the best operating environments that you would have would be in Northern Europe and Western Europe, hence so many foundations in Germany, for instance. You would have a more difficult context with more stringent laws in the Balkan countries, in Central Europe, and kind of in Southern Europe, especially if you include Turkey. And sadly, we're seeing that while there has historically been quite a bit of red tape in quite a few countries in Europe for giving, the sector is really increasingly under scrutiny. And in some parts of Europe, we're seeing that the sector in itself is also facing barriers that are becoming more and more challenging for foundations to do their work and to continue kind of the philanthropic practices that they have. So this kind of as a background.
And what about the Netherlands? I'm Dutch, so
the Netherlands. The Netherlands is a pretty good philanthropic country, though we have seen over the past couple of years that there have also been new laws that make it more complicated for philanthropy, also in the Netherlands. And that tax regimes also in Belgium, in my own country, are becoming less favorable than they were before. And while I don't want to question the reasons why this is being done, it does have an impact on kind of the possibility for philanthropy to increase the giving in the light of the challenges that we're facing. So
all right. And interesting that you were saying the differences, for example, in Germany between East and West. I'm from the northeast of the Netherlands, so I think we also have probably the minority share of foundations based in our region. But it's interesting to not only look at the countries, but also where our foundations based and why is that? I think they can definitely help to understand also the history and the operations of a foundation better.
Foundations and philanthropic organizations are very much a reflection of the culture in which they operate, and they've grown sometimes over decades of engagement, of social engagement, of political context, of cultural context, and that really influences the landscape from not only one country to the next, but also one region to the next. So that would be really
it makes a lot of sense. But it's good that the data also tells that. Hey, and I think all of us are very interested in the current developments and the trends in the sector, and knowing it's a very broad range of foundations. I'm curious if you can tell us a bit about general trends that you see from Philea's perspective, and more specifically, with all the developments in the world, with big donors that are phasing out and other developments that are happening. Do you see that affecting also the philanthropic sector in Europe?
Absolutely. I think definitely. I think the concerns around civil society's increased fragility are something that are very much felt by philanthropic organizations and is really top of mind, definitely in all the conversations I'm having within our membership. I think a lot of it is actually a lot of the kind of changes in the sector that we're seeing are not just occurring now because of what we're seeing over the past couple of months, but there have really been quite a few changes also over the past years in the sector. So I think with the pandemic that really affected every part of society, with criticism on traditional philanthropy that is also heard and then used as an opportunity to improve the way of working, with kind of new actors coming on board, foundations have really gone through quite a deep reflection. And I'm not talking about all of them, but there has been a lot of reflection within the sector around kind of internal setups and ways of working, but also around very practically grant-making practices. What does good look like in terms of donating to beneficiaries and to partners, and around kind of the focus area of philanthropic work. So what are kind of the new themes that foundations have funded over the past couple of years? And if that's interesting, I can kind of lay out a little bit about those three kind of major sets of changes that we've seen over the past years, and then go to a question around what's happening now, because of course we're all waking up to a new reality that is definitely challenging. I think in terms of kind of internal setups and ways of working, I would say over the past 5 years, but it's definitely something that has started before, you would see foundations invest a lot more time in trying to make sure that they walk the talk in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion, also in their own setup and in their own governance, in their own teams, so that they really have diverse teams that are able to take better informed decisions and be more of a reflection of what they want to do in the world. A trend that has also been going on, I think, I would say over the past 10 years, has really been also around trying to find new ways for collaborative funding. So you would see that there are quite a few collaborative or pooled funds that have been put together in different forms or shapes. And that's something that has been growing also in the past decade. I wouldn't say that it's kind of the majority of the funding. Most of the funding is really from one foundation to whatever partner they want to support, but that idea of collaboration is definitely something that we've seen increase. Also in terms of not only collaborating among foundations, but also collaborating between foundations and, for instance, public funders, trying to see where you can have alignment or more impact by working together.
Yeah.
One that I have found interesting as well in terms of internal setups is that while foundations tend to fund with a long horizon, they've also, some of them would also really be considering shorter strategic cycles because they want to have more agility to respond to emerging challenges. And then another one that has been quite high on the agenda as a reflection, I would say, more than anything else, is around should foundations really be set up for perpetuity? And for some foundations, this is just mandatory because it's the way they have been set up and it's in their bylaws and or sometimes even in law. But you've also had a couple of foundations in Europe as well that decided to really sunset. So feeling that the challenges faced by society are so fast that they wanted to spend down, for instance, in a kind of horizon of 12, 15 years, so that kind of they could have the biggest impact now. So that's a first set of general challenges that we've general changes we've seen in terms of internal setups and ways of working. And then maybe on the kind of grant making practices as well. So there, I think this is interesting as well, as I would say as a potential partner of a foundation, is an interest of foundations to have more participatory approaches. So for instance, we at Philea, we've developed some best practices around child and youth participation in foundations. So how, if you're interested in funding children and youth, how do you get them to co-design with you and be part of the cohort that helps you understand where where the funding should go? That's one. Another one in terms of grant making practices would be around really taking the need to invest with more flexibility and with a more long-term partnership more seriously. So trying to give partners also that kind of that safety of being able to develop their programs with a longer term horizon and with more flexibility, which connects very much to another point that I'm sure is of interest as well, around trust-based practices. So trusting that the people that you fund actually know what the answer looks like. And with that kind of a general also valuing of community and making sure that communities are much more also around the table when designing solutions. And then maybe kind of a last set of changes or trends that we've seen over the past 10 to 5 years is also a desire to use their toolbox with more flexibility. So foundations have grants as part of what they can do, but an increasing number of foundations are also interested in kind of investing with impact. So investing in startups or innovative businesses with the idea of generating public benefit impacts, but also with the potential of having a return, which is not the primary concern for the investment, but is also part of what then allows the foundations to reinvest in other areas of work or to use that money for grant making. And a lot of conversations, I think, in general, have been around how do we make sure that we take risks, which is something that foundations are interested in. They're well placed for it. It's very difficult, requires internal discussions, requires alignments with the board, etc. And having a bit more of a, I would say, systemic and holistic approach to the solutions that they bring. So those are trends that we've seen over the past couple of years, right? And of course, if you then look at the moment we're living now, I think foundations in Europe, but also in the US, are very concerned with what is happening, depending also on where they sit, depending on the area of work that they fund, and depending on the culture and range of activities that they have. But there is an increased concern, definitely, around what is happening. And a questioning also of the role of foundations in this context. Do they maintain neutrality? Sometimes they're obliged by law to do so, and sometimes they're not allowed to have activities that could be potentially seen as being political. What does that mean for them in the current state of the world? But also responding to, as you said, the recent winding down of funding, for instance, from USAID, but also at European level from many of the donors, trying to think through what that means in terms of their ability to support the sector. And I think the first reality that we need to keep into account is the limited size of the philanthropic sector in terms of its potential for giving. So 77 billion euros. If you compare that with USAID, which had about 40,000 annual billions of dollars that was donated. I mean, even if we pulled all of the European philanthropic capital together to fund only what USAID used to fund, we'd be able to cover that, but it's about it, and that would leave everything unsorted. So philanthropy cannot fill that gap. I think that's unfortunately a reality. But philanthropy can really think through how it can best support in the current context. And I thought I would share a couple of recommendations that were concluded in a conversation we had with about 100 foundations immediately after the USAID freeze was announced, that I hope can also be somewhat of a support for those who are indeed struggling today. So the recommendations that came out of that conversations were, in a nutshell, first, a realization of the immediate needs in terms of supporting beneficiaries and partners and grantees to just pay the bills at the end of the month, because for some that is just no longer a possibility. They were cut off funding that was essential for them to survive. So foundations are looking into possible bridge loans. They shared recommendations around assisting with cash flow issues, around loosening some of the reporting deadlines so that grantees would have a little bit more breathing space, around looking for strategic alignment so that things could be done a little bit more efficiently in the current context. So that's kind of the immediate support in some of the things that came out of that conversation. Then a second area of recommendation that came out of that conversation was around strengthening local philanthropy ecosystems, because if we have more local philanthropy infrastructure, then hopefully we have a stronger philanthropic sector also at local level that can then also be better equipped to respond to the many needs of grantees. And with that also building in resilience as part of the work of philanthropic organizations, so that there is kind of that resilience approach also for the ecosystem itself. Then a third set of recommendations were really around addressing shrinking civic space, especially in Eastern European countries, in Western Balkan countries, but increasingly everywhere. And with that also an acknowledgement of the fact that human rights organizations are in particular affected by some of the recent developments. And then a fourth set of recommendations was around the longer term organizational resilience of grantees and reflections around how foundations can be more generous with funding overheads, with supporting internal staff systems around staff well-being, capacity building for organizations, building contingency plans, just so that the funding that comes from the sector decreases the fragility of civil society, so that civil society would be in itself also a little bit more equipped to navigate the storms that we're navigating today. But again, I mean, the sector in itself, unfortunately, is it's limited in terms of its size, and the gaps that we see are really important. So it's a matter of using the resources that are there wisely so as to support grantees in a way that really builds that resilience, while also being aware of the sector itself being under threat. So philanthropy itself is being questioned and scrutinized, and regimes also across Europe are increasingly putting up barriers for philanthropic practices that make it more difficult for philanthropy to really fully unleash its potential. I think that's also a reality that we're facing.
Yeah, that's good that you mentioned that. It's we shouldn't take this sector also for granted. It's it's being attacked as well, and not only the NGOs and the other recipients are being hit by all these developments, but it's the whole system, of course, that is being questioned here and is under threat. So
yeah, no, definitely.
I was just curious when you were talking about the internal developments earlier, but you mentioned the walk the talk on diversity, on collaborative funding, and I was wondering, is it a type of foundation that is particularly focusing on this, or is it something you see in general?
I think these are questions that are being asked by the sector in general, and that come up in leadership conversations, come up in board conversations. But every organization will be different in terms of its ability to respond, also because of the context in which it lives, and so it's always really challenging to give kind of a one size fits all answer to these kind of questions. In fact, at Philea we have a saying, which is that if you know one foundation, you know one foundation, because they are so incredibly different. They are so incredibly different. And of course you have foundations that are molded on a philosophy of systems change, but you also have foundations that are molded or have been molded 5 centuries ago on a mindset of more charity work, and and those are legacies that foundation leaders also have to navigate and work with.
Yeah, maybe too difficult too deep to go into now, but especially the topic of collaboration, and we have many organizations in this room. Does it help if you partner up with other organizations and then, as a group, go to a foundation, or is it?
I think it's definitely an approach to consider. I think what most foundations would be looking for is to have the best possible answer for the problem that you're presenting.
Yeah,
So oftentimes making sure that you pull expertise and capacity and bring together the best possible stakeholders around the table, including your partners, will definitely be something to consider.
yeah,
But then it will depend on one organization, one foundation to the next.
of course, of course. Yeah, yeah, yeah. All right, thanks.
And maybe
So
just
yeah,
I'm just
yeah,
thinking to respond to your question. I think it's on the one hand the collaboration element of the foundations or the grantees that apply for the funding, but there is also a practice of collaborating more between foundations. So I
yeah,
mentioned some of the pooled funds that are there. I think those are
yeah.
interesting initiatives to look at.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. That's a good suggestion. Thanks. Yeah. And you mentioned there are 165,000 foundations in Europe, and you have to, if you know one, you know one, right? That's the
It's pretty much it. And it's
so
176, but that's just the 10,000.
76. Sorry, yeah, here you go. But so if you want to get to know them, it's a whole lot of work. So, do you have any tips for us on how we can navigate in this enormous pool of foundations and see which foundations might be a good starting point for us as possible recipients to talk to?
Um, I think the number one recommendation I would make is to see within your own area of work which foundations are interested in that field, and approach foundations that actually can partner with you and that you can partner with as well, in terms of your mindset, in terms of the kind of work that you do, and in terms of the expertise that you bring in, and making sure that you as a grantee also bring in that expertise and that desire to be a partner, that desire to think about solutions together, that unique perspective that you have that allows also the foundation to achieve the goals that it has in terms of its public benefits impact. So I think really starting from that perspective is definitely a good beginning.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So not only look at the money that they might have, but also especially on the impact that they want to have in the future, and see if we can bring our vision and their vision together. That's the we can help each other.
Yeah, and approach them as potential partners. I think
Exactly.
from the NGO and INGO fields, I've been absolutely impressed with the knowledge that sits in the sector. I think foundations, or the ones that we're privileged to work with, are have staff that is incredibly passionate about what they do, that have deep knowledge on the sector that they work in, and being a thought partner with foundations around the area that you're interested in working in that matches theirs is a good beginning for the relationship. But then from that, building trust, and from that also making sure that you are as representative as you can be, and that the solutions that you're crafting also bring in the people that you serve as a grantee. I think those are kind of elements that I would definitely recommend.
Yeah. Yeah. What we often hear as HVFC is that when organizations explore foundations, they sometimes see on the website, we don't take unsolicited proposals, for example. What you were just describing, I think that might be the solution for them, right? So it's not so much about just submitting your proposal, but start a dialogue and build trust, and if you can be equal partners in achieving the impact that you desire.
Yeah, and I think also remembering that foundations have, and philanthropic foundations in particular, they have financial means and they have non-financial means. And sometimes they would be in a position to help you build a network, or to bring in expertise, or to build bridges to other sectors. And that kind of non-financial support, I understand in many cases is not what you need to survive as an organization, but could be a very good investment towards the future thriving of your organization as well. And I think seeing foundations as partners, as thought partners, as connectors, as bridge builders beyond the money that they can bring, is going to allow for a much more relevant relationship than just approaching them from the perspective of the funding that they can bring. Even if, again, I completely understand that need. I mean, I think it's unfortunately existential for many, undoubtedly also in this room. So yeah.
No, that's a good recommendation. Thanks for that. And you mentioned in one of your sentences that there also that Europe is a huge foundation market, but maybe not the largest one in the world. The US, I think, is the largest foundation market. You're, of course, an expert on the European foundation market, but are there any differences between those two markets that we should be aware of that you can share, or is that difficult maybe from your perspective?
No, I think kind of in general, there are more public benefit foundations in Europe than in the US, but the US foundations are considerably larger than some of the European foundations, even though currently, depending on how you look at it, some sources argue that the largest foundation in the world today is Novo Nordisk, so that is a European foundation. But it depends on how you approach that ranking. So the US has very large foundations that are more traditional in terms of being endowed foundations, and their approach to kind of that perpetuity of the endowment is something that is definitely also part of the US landscape. They also have a different tax regime than is the case in Europe. We also have a different tax regime from one country to the next. So again, that kind of complexity and diversity in Europe. So those are some of the kind of differences that we do see between Europe and the US. But I think it's also relevant to mention that the current scrutiny on the sector and the barriers that are being put up, the US foundation sector is definitely also in a mode of caution. I think the current US government is not necessarily increasing a favorable treatment of philanthropic giving in the US either. So that's a challenge to be aware of, I think.
Yeah, that's good. Thanks. Yeah. Hey, and you mentioned this one of the trends that there's a movement towards more, in my wording, also to trust-based philanthropy, right? So meaning less conditions and maybe more on a programmatic way that you fund an organization, or maybe even on an organizational level that you give funding. How can NGOs benefit from this trend, and what is the trick here because I think most of the organizations here would, well, I don't know the nice words to say, but would do a whole lot to get more unrestricted funding. So how can it benefit from this trend?
Again, I think it's about having a relationship with your donor and having honest conversations about what your needs are. I think, at least from the foundations that we represent as Philea, we're seeing that foundations do care about their grantees and they want organizations to be resilient. They understand that overheads are part of the reality of foundations, that if you are asked to deliver from one output to the next based on earmarked funding, that the system itself might risk being fragilized. So I think it's about having those honest conversations with a donor. I think having also been in the NGO and INGO sector, I know how NGOs and INGOs would oftentimes really try to downplay the needs that they have in terms of overheads. And I think having a transparent and clear message around this is the reality that we're facing is always going to make the relationship stronger. I think I would not hold back in terms of presenting true costs that you have. Doesn't mean that they're going to fund them. You have no guarantee because it will depend on one foundation to the next again. But being clear also around this is the true costs that we have around this program. And it includes paying for the overheads needed for our team to have IT, to have HR support, to have a day where they invest in strategy, to have a team building day, to have, the things that you do need to have to be able to run a proper organization. I think being clear about what that looks like and then having a conversation around the possibilities is a helpful starting point. Again, it will depend from one foundation to the next. But as a practice, I would plead in favor of having that transparent conversation around what it is that you need to be able to have the impact that you believe you can have.
I hear that. I can also imagine from the fundraiser's point of view that it's a challenge because the market is getting more and more competitive, and then be open and transparent about all your costs. And I can very much imagine that sometimes it's easier to just imagine that those costs are not there and just hope that you become more attractive to the donor because of that. And that's
absolutely. Absolutely. And I think I also, again, in the current context, the demands on foundations are going to increase, right? I think $40 billion annual giving from USAID has suddenly stopped. I think that's a big amount. We're seeing similar trends in other countries. So the foundation sector is being called upon to fill in a lot of the gaps that are emerging now, and the sector is too small to do that. So I think, again, making sure that you bring in the expertise, that you do what you're best at, know what you're good at with rigor. Do that with a vision on where the changes that you can bring, or where you can sustain systems that need to be sustained, and then have that conversation. It's absolutely challenging, and it is incredibly intimidating, I think, also for fundraisers to do that. I think ultimately it's in the interest of the work that you do, because otherwise you run into a starvation mode where eventually you increase the fragility of your own organization, because you're running behind funding that doesn't really help you to sustain the fundamentals of your work.
No, thank you. All right, looking at the time, I would love to hear a lot more from you, but let's also open the room for questions. And before I ask Rick to share some questions that are being asked in the chat and can still be asked, I just want to mention that the topic that was just discussed by Delphine as well, about unrestricted funding, that is actually the topic of our next webinar, where we are going to have Dr. Pamela Wiepkim presenting what is unrestricted funding, what is earmarked, what is trust-based philanthropy, and we go much deeper into that topic on April 15th. So hope to see all of you there as well. As promised, I will thank you, Delphine, for this. I will close the recording, and then